It's rather tough following two such accomplished storytellers. The story that I want to tell, though, is one of elegant simplicity. It was a title I suggested to Dave Talbot when I looked at the picture that was emerging from an understanding of gravity, which I spoke about last year. And as I worked on it, I understood that the universe really is much simpler than anyone could have considered. But then at the same time, there was something that occurred in Canada, a presentation which I watched with dismay called The Elegant or the Simplicity of Everything. I'll see if I can get this to, it says the connection's lost. Here we go. So, the elegant simplicity of the electric universe. How come so many clever people can't see it? Only in the last few months have I found out why. It's an understanding that's important for everyone, including all of you here. Today's specialisation is the enemy of science. It produces more complication than simplification because experts mislead each other with things, as Tom said, they don't know. The result is a useless reflection in a shattered mirror. So, who am I to be speaking to you about the elegant simplicity of the universe? Looking back, I can see how I got into this position, how I became a boundary writer of science, as the science editor of the Canberra Times dubbed me some years ago. From the earliest age, I was curious about how things worked. I read books and investigated things on my own. Other kids did the same, so I didn't consider myself exceptionally clever. Looking back, it seems the event that separated me from my peers was being inspired by an extraordinary story of planetary chaos by Immanuel Velikovsky in his book Worlds in Collision. This happened while I was in high school. So I began to question many of the things I was being taught. And when I got to university, I think I was the only physics undergrad who used to haunt the anthropology shelves of the library, checking to see whether Velikovsky had cherry-picked his sources or whether he had made a real case to be answered. And I came to the conclusion that he had made a very good case to be answered. So what had Velikovsky done? He'd thrown down a gauntlet to astronomers that they rejected by having his best-selling book burned. So book burning didn't finish centuries ago. It happened last century. Velikovsky's heresy was to publish that electromagnetism played a dominant role in the solar system, particularly during periods of planetary chaos. Many years later, and shortly before Velikovsky's passing, I visited him at his home in Princeton and discussed this issue about the electrical nature of gravity, because this was perhaps the single most important thing that the astronomers threw at him, that his mechanism disobeyed Newton's laws. Once again, this is the certainty that there's only this law, there's no what if, there's some other aspect to the mechanism. So, it has taken me all of the intervening years since then, and there's quite a few, to overcome the education I received as a student, to find the few true pioneers of science, and to relate this to everyday experience. I firmly believe that the electric universe is simple, and you could begin to teach it in primary school. It's an amazing and engrossing story which fires the imagination, and the explanations relate to everyday experience. The electric universe is a cultural as well as a scientific revolution that has been millennia in coming. It allows us to understand for the first time the obsessive fear of the planetary gods and their doomsday weapon, the mighty thunderbolt. The phenomenal thunderbolt of the planetary gods is the link between our human story and the science of the electric universe. Some of the renowned scientists of the past, like Newton and Faraday, predicted that electricity is the secret to understanding gravity and therefore the universe. But in the early 20th century, following the madness of World War, we reverted to the ancient geometric religious mysticism of Pythagoras and Plato. In fact, mathematicians were formerly called geometers. And wartime established a fire hose of government funding of science that hasn't ceased. It has had the unintended consequences of paralysing progress within huge bureaucratic institutions and fostering censorship in the form of anonymous peer review, which stalls even minor advances. Paradigm shifts come from individuals and are resisted vigorously by authorities. The wartime command to large groups of scientists to shut up and calculate has become, with the advent of computers, shut up and simulate. Simulations' pretty pictures are routinely used to persuade non-expert audiences. Science is now in show business producing CGI virtual reality entertainment on big screens, but computer models can only reflect back what you put in. As a scientist, one must attend to what lies beyond any model. Here's M74, a perfect example of elegant simplicity. It's called the perfect spiral galaxy. Cosmologists can't explain its formation or rotation without inventing weird stuff like dark matter and a central black hole. But adding arbitrary patches to a model to make it work on a computer screen is not simplifying, and it's certainly not elegant. It's generally a sign that your model is incomplete or just plain wrong. You'll notice on the picture the strings of red spots in M74. They're starbirth regions that are brought out in this image. I'll discuss this later because they confirm the electric universe. The definition of elegance for a scientific theory or solution to a problem is well-designed, pleasingly ingenious, and simple. Symmetry and balance are also often important. But assessments of ingenuity and simplicity are subjective, like an individual's response to modern art. Paul Gauguin wrote, "The history of modern art is also the history of the progressive loss of art's audience. Art has increasingly become the concern of the artist and the bafflement of the public." So where are the art critics of modern science when presented with a chalkboard covered in mathematical symbols, most of which are undefined in any real sense? Critics of this art are branded deniers, as if consensus constitutes a religious truth. Only a belief can be denied. And if it's a consensus belief, it ain't science, as Michael Crichton said in one of his famous speeches. The late astronomer Halton Arp lamented that investigative journalism, or in other words, art criticism, in science is dead. The Big Bang is the antithesis of elegance and simplicity, with its random explosions and collisions and its multiplicity of forces and particles. Despite this, here's an authority who said publicly that everything is not just simple, but astonishingly simple. Neil Turok, director of the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics in Waterloo, Canada, speaking on October the 7th last year, the astonishing simplicity of everything, but that implies you know everything. But I will show you that there are many very basic things that experts don't know they don't know. Neil Turok defined simplicity. Simplicity means concepts which unify. They bring together disparate ideas, disparate knowledge, make sense of them, and simplify. I agree. But adding fudge factors like dark matter and dark energy is the antithesis of simplicity. What other disparate knowledge was canvassed? Certainly not Halton Arp's observational research that shows the universe is not expanding. Certainly not peer-reviewed plasma cosmology that explains simply and predicts so much in cosmology. Simple concepts are those that explain as much as we possibly can with the least possible number of assumptions, and I agree that's a good test. The problem is how little theoretical physics actually explains. Quantum physics has no explanation, gravity has no explanation, and the two are incompatible. Theoretical physics, as it stands today, is very limited. But as British astrophysicist Mike Disney shows, the number of free parameters assumptions in the Big Bang exceeds the measurements. So consensus Big Bang cosmology fails this test at the starting gate. A recent massive supercomputer simulation produced a universe of galaxies that seems to match observations, despite using concepts that are invalid. So what good are computer simulations? With all the free parameters, it could have produced a platypus or a koala bear. Nevertheless, simulations are offered as experiments and proof of theories. After describing the Big Bang, Turok said, "The universe has turned out to be stunningly simple. It's simpler than any of our models can explain." But hang on a minute, if none of the models can explain the simplicity, surely all of the models have failed. Now, here's the astonishingly simple equation of all known physics. I would ask, where is life and consciousness in that equation? You'll notice that Peter Higgs gets a mention, second from the right. Turok said, they found the Higgs boson. No, they didn't. If the Higgs mechanism explains masses, it should be able to calculate the mass ratio of the proton to the electron. It can't. And who in this audience thinks that's simple? That it allows them to understand everything. But here we come to an important qualifier. The grand unified theory is compact and elegant in mathematical terms. Turok then launches into numbers, Pythagoras' theorem, imaginary numbers, allowing the solution of any equation, and an enthusiastic endorsement of mathematics for the rest of the lecture. But unless each symbol and operator can be defined in real physical terms, an equation is physically meaningless. Mismatches with theory cause the invention of ever more particles and forces, which violates the claim of simplicity and elegance. In fact, mathematics is an art often applied unscientifically to science. Unless you have all of the correct physical concepts and definitions in your mathematical model, the conclusions cannot be relied upon. The art becomes surreal. And the genius Johann Wolfgang von Goethe wrote, "Mathematics has the completely false reputation of yielding infallible conclusions." So we come to art and surrealism, and the celebrity Kip Thorne, Feynman Emeritus Professor of Theoretical Physics in Caltech, who has this to say about simplicity. "Simplicity is the touchstone in finding new physical laws. If it's elegant, then it's a rough rule of thumb, you're on the right track." Thorne was the executive producer of the sci-fi film Interstellar. The film blurb says, "His math guided the creation of the mesmerizing and the most accurate simulation ever of what a black hole would look like." And it was the product of a year of work by 30 people and thousands of computers. Kip Thorne said, "I think the thing that makes this film different is that the science is woven into this film and into the story from the beginning, and woven in deeply." Real science. Quite the reverse is true. Cosmology has become science fiction entertainment. There's nothing scientific about the slide on the right from Thorne's Wolfgang Pauli lecture in Zurich in 2011. A black hole is made from warped space and time. But as Steve Crothers has shown, black hole theory makes no sense mathematically, let alone physically. How do you make a material object out of two immaterial concepts, space and time? As science teacher Evan Camp's student asked, how can smart people believe this stuff? Recently, I found the answer, and it shows that our education systems damage our ability to do science. The first thing to do, and I think Tom touched on this, is to first know yourself. The distinguished Dr. Ian McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, doctor, writer, former Oxford literary scholar who wrote The Master and His Emissary, subtitled The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. His shorter e-book is The Divided Brain and the Search for Meaning, which I recommend to you. There are also some excellent YouTube videos, interviews with him, and also an RSA animation, from which I will have a few images. He points out the brain is profoundly divided and this organ is profoundly asymmetric. And he asks the question, why would nature divide brains if there wasn't some use for that? He said, it's not true that one part of the brain does reason and the other does emotion. Both are profoundly involved. It seems the main function of the corpus callosum, that joining fibres between the left and right hemispheres, is to inhibit the other hemisphere. Something very important is going on here. The right hemisphere reacts faster but inhibits less strongly. I should point out too that physically they are different. One hemisphere is slightly smaller than the other, and the left hemisphere is slightly rotated, and the surface convolutions are different, and even the chemical signalling is different on both sides. So they have a different job to perform. This is a slide from the RSA Academies, the Royal Society of Arts Academies in the UK. I presume you've probably all seen the animated swift drawing while somebody is lecturing. This is from a YouTube video that I recommend you have a look at. In this, he shows that the left hemisphere is narrowly focused and attends to detail, while the right hemisphere is more broadly focused. It's alert and open to what's going on around. And he gives an example of the chicken. He said, the left hemisphere in the chicken is looking for the seeds amongst the dirt. The right hemisphere is making sure the chicken doesn't become somebody else's lunch. And I think that's a good way to look at it. In other words, the left hemisphere is survival, the right hemisphere is a broad picture of what's going on around you. I wrote to Ian McGilchrist and I sent him a copy of a paper, PDF of a paper, which had actually studied the left and right hemisphere and imaged the activity that goes on when you ask physics questions of a student. And you'll notice that the left hemisphere lights up like a Christmas tree and the right hemisphere is rather passive. The different colours just refer to different characteristics of what's being asked. Algebraic equation representation is red, the green is periodicity, energy flow is blue. This brings me to, we've all heard of cognitive dissonance, as if you're presented with something that you just cannot handle, it just doesn't make any sense to you. And it seems that it's a result of the differences between the two hemispheres of the brain. The left hemisphere, as I said, has narrow focus, only sees what it expects to see, and has automatic machine-like responses. It's about survival. Education in science reinforces the bits rather than the whole picture, so the left hemisphere is involved in the training. It's a vicious cycle because it focuses on aspects we expect to see. You get stuck in a certain way of thinking. Also, the left hemisphere needs to be in control. And the left hemisphere people, that's those who have dominant left hemisphere, exhibit denial. We can all think of many examples of this. I think Michael Shermer's visit to our last meeting is an example. The right hemisphere, meaning comes from understanding the whole. In other words, it's trying to take in the whole picture and being comfortable, and this is important, with not being able to grasp everything. You don't need to understand the creation of the universe. What's more, he said, happiness comes from understanding your connectedness and engagement with the world. I would say the universe, because that's what the electric universe is about, connectedness. Left hemisphere Big Bang cosmology is consequently, I would say, hopeless. McGilchrist's e-book is subtitled, Why Are We So Unhappy? And this is the whole thing about the electric universe. There's no subject that it shouldn't touch on if it is a real cosmology. He says, happiness comes from social connectedness and a sense of purpose beyond the immediate. I would say that seems to characterise our conferences. There is a great sense of purpose. Modern goal-oriented education, on the other hand, and its constant audit and inquisition, turns off the intellectually adventurous teachers and students. We don't understand the world by putting it together bit by bit. Quite the opposite, in fact. So, left hemisphere training. The knowledge that's mediated by the left hemisphere is within a closed system. And this is typical of the scientific approach, of course. You isolate a small part of something and then try and analyse that. It has the advantage of appearing perfect, but the perfection is bought ultimately at the price of emptiness. So you see, the Big Bang is a closed system. The universe expanded from a non-physical point 13.5 billion years ago, and increasing entropy and disorder is expected, but we see increasing order. The universe is not a closed system. Geology is a closed system. So geologists could simply extrapolate things seen today back a few billion years and make up any story they fancied. Biology is a closed system. Each organism is self-contained. Brain circuitry will explain consciousness. Sheldrake and others show this is invalid. The closed mechanical model is wrong. Einstein's inertial frames are closed systems. They have lost all external references. You've got to ask, the speed of light in an inertial reference frame, with respect to what? Some arbitrary observer. So modern science is empty of real meaning. Left hemisphere dominance is the safe way, a way that minimises risk and provides a way forward that seemingly is a more secure and logical approach to decision making. The machine metaphor reduces things to isolated bits and loses sight of the connected whole. Stars are isolated objects. Galaxies are isolated objects. We are isolated individuals. It's chickens pecking at seeds in the dirt. Of course, when you're tied up with this narrow view, you end up with a hall of mirrors effect. The more we get trapped into this, the more we undercut the things that might have let us out of it, and we just get reflected back into more of what we know about what we know about what we know about what we know. So the greatest problem becomes the things we don't know. More information. We have it in spades, but we get less and less able to use it, to understand it, to be wise. These are Ian McGilchrist's words. Instead, we go searching in the crap for signals we expect to see. That's my words. There's a paradoxical relationship, Ian says, as I know as a psychiatrist, between the knowledge of the parts and wisdom about the whole. It's the machine model that is supposed to answer everything, but it doesn't. In other words, the theory of everything. This is a perfect example of a hall of mirrors. This is the Large Hadron Collider control room. Experiments are done on computer screens. It's virtual research. In our computerized world, the virtual makes some things seem more real. As one scientist said, sexy images sell. We see that all the time in the media. The picture, however, has become fragmented and surreal science fiction. Mistakes no longer mean going back to the drawing board. Mistakes now need to be debugged. It creates a classic hall of mirrors reflecting a single model. Signals buried in noise become statistical discoveries and proof. The computers are programmed to find deep in the noise what they expect to see. I think the LIGO and the gravitational wave experiment is a prime example. Images on a screen become real discoveries or proof. The Higgs boson, gravitational waves. It illustrates groupthink and left hemisphere dominance, a blindness to alternatives. Sorry, what happened then? But paradigm shifts come from individuals using their mind, not large teams using computers. The ultimate black boxes. They invent new forces and particles to reclaim control of a model. The quark, the gluon, dark energy, dark matter. So big science is failing. There have been no fundamental advances for a century. It's accepted that the basis of what is now known is more or less correct. A Copernican revolution is totally unthinkable within the current system. There are not many differences between the modern academy and the universities in the 16th and 17th century which conform to the church and to Aristotle's texts. The symptoms? Science is non-predictive. There are continual surprises. Counter-arguments are ignored or unpublished, and the history of science is sanitized to give the impression of progress. What's the remedy? Evan Camp is a teacher, an 8th grade science teacher who ran an Electric Universe group after school. He presented an outstanding talk at EU 2013, Exciting Students with Unsettled Science. It's available on the thunderbolts.info YouTube channel. He said, "Every mile you go in the wrong direction is really a 2-mile error. Unlearning is twice as hard as learning. In fact, it's much harder than that, because at the end of the first mile you are lost, because what you have learnt inhibits new learning and accelerates forgetting. This requires an active remedial process. It requires a conceptual mediation program as early as possible. Such a program has been tested by Dr. Harry Linden in South Australia with encouraging results. He says, the primary goal of science educators involves helping young people to acquire scientific knowledge with greater facility, to achieve a deeper level of understanding in their studies, and for these understandings to be lasting. It has been established, however, that a universal problem in schooling concerns the fact that science learning is evidently difficult for most students. A general conclusion that even students who are successful in examinations are unable to retain and apply scientific concepts. When students move into high school, many experience disappointment because the science they are taught is neither relevant nor engaging and doesn't connect with their interest and experiences. When new information or ideas disagree or conflict with what the left hemisphere already knows, the left hemisphere inhibits or denies the new information and causes accelerated forgetting of the new knowledge or skill. It protects all prior knowledge. Old learning disables new learning. According to Linden, it's why old habits die hard. Old way, new way learning, where the old and the new are repeatedly contrasted, is a method developed by Dr. Linden and a colleague, and it's an innovative teaching method. It's a system where the student actively and repeatedly contrasts the old and the new until the inhibition is overcome. It forces the student to think about thinking. This is important for what is to follow, because it will help those who follow the Thunderbolts movement to understand the problems others face when confronted with a paradigm shift of the magnitude of the electric universe, and also some areas of your own personal denial. So, cosmology must address the infinitesimal as well as the infinite. So let's go to the heart of the matter, because, incredibly, mass is undefined. In every textbook and encyclopedia, the amount of mass is confused with the amount of matter, perhaps because they both begin with the letter M. This means that no scientist understands E equals mc squared. This confusion allows particle physicists to talk of creation and annihilation of matter, which is impossible without understanding what matter is. It's not physics. E equals mc squared is simply telling us that mass is a measure of the amount of energy held in matter. Particles have no mass, we're told. Armed with this ignorance, the standard particle model says subatomic particles have no intrinsic mass, which is nonsense. Are they saying protons and electrons have no rest mass, no energy? It seems so. In the standard particle model, mass is provided externally by a kind of cosmic treacle of imaginary Higgs bosons. The total cost of finding something, dubbed the Higgs boson at the Large Hadron Collider, ran over $13 billion in July 2012. At a running cost of $1 billion a year, that makes it more than $17 billion wasted chasing the grin of the Cheshire Cat. The LHC operates like smashing countless jumbo jets into mountains and picking over the debris to see how they fly. But the whole is more than the sum of the bits we can see. We are not dealing with closed systems. Even worse, it's like asking one of Douglas Adams' telephone hygienists to do the investigation. The investigators are not properly trained. Energy is undefined. All you will find in textbooks are examples of different forms of energy. The Big Bang is supposed to have originated from pure energy, which is nonsense when energy only makes sense in relation to matter in motion, with respect to all other matter. But matter hasn't been defined in any physical sense involving sensible internal movement. The quantum realm is weird. It's admitted by leading physicists that no one understands quantum mechanics. It's incompatible with Einstein's postulate of no instantaneous information transfer, and it seems to involve even the experimenter's thoughts in the outcome of some experiments. Once again, any experiment is not a closed system, as physicists like to assume. That is why the quantum realm appears weird. Light and the electric force are mysteriously transferred through empty space. We have all experienced the force between two magnets. What's happening in the space between them? The pioneers of electromagnetism knew there has to be a medium to transfer the electric force. They called it the ether. The ether has to be an electrically polarizable medium that fills the universe. In that way you can daisy chain the electric force directly. It's a longitudinal force. And applying the speed of light limit to that makes no sense whatsoever, because light is a wave motion. I think I've said before, that's like the difference between pulling on a rope and feeling the tug at the other end almost instantly, and waving one end of the rope and waiting for the wave to get to the other end. Light is a slow process in the universe. So if we have this ether that fills the universe, space is full. There's no such thing as a perfect vacuum. Einstein knew there has to be an ether, but his postulates somehow did away with it. He admitted that his theory of relativity would fail if the Earth's motion through the ether were detected, That's because these inertial frames of reference would not be equivalent. It would be like having one observer experiencing a gentle breeze from the ether wind while another might be suffering a howling gale. As it turns out, Dayton Miller repeated the Michelson-Morley ether experiments far more rigorously and at different elevations. He found an ether drift. Sadly, left hemisphere training denied and quickly forgot this fact. So let's have a look at the standard particle model. An atom, once a promise of fundamental simplicity, is really a nucleus within a hazy, probabilistic fog of electrons. The nucleus is some protons and neutrons held together by the mysterious short-range nuclear or strong force. The particles in the nucleus have a hidden, unknown number of weird, undetectable bits inside. These bits are appearing and disappearing in defiance of a principle of science that miracles are forbidden. Meanwhile, a recent report from the Large Hadron Collider suggests new findings that don't fit this model. Here's a snapshot of a proton by Professor Matthew Strassler. He writes, "Imagine all of the quarks, up, down and strange, that is U, D and S, anti-quarks, U, D and S with a bar on top, and gluons, a G, zipping around near the speed of light, banging into each other and appearing and disappearing." So a proton is said to be some quarks held together by some gluons, which are themselves the quantized manifestations of the strong force. There is no mention of how a force manifests as a particle. It gets much worse. A gluon is really one of several colours of gluon, but it also has the simultaneous property of anti-colour. Gluons mediate the interaction between quarks, but they also mediate the interaction between themselves and quarks. That's right, gluons are the strong force, but they also experience the strong force. Happily for the physicists, quarks are unobservable in principle because they only exist inside the nucleon. It's very convenient. This is simple. You can forget elegance. This is extreme, narrow, left hemisphere focus on a model with no basic definitions to make sense of the words being used. Andrew Pickering, the author of Constructing Quarks, who did a sociological study of particle physics, and it's an interesting book, says there's no obligation on anyone to take account of what 20th century science has to say. To listen too closely to scientists may be simply to stifle the imagination, that is the right hemisphere. Worldviews are cultural products. There is no need to be intimidated by them. We come to the electric universe model of the atom. The electrically neutral atom is made of charged particles, positive and negative, in equal numbers, together with a number of neutral particles called neutrons, stating the obvious. All subatomic particles are real, with real locations in space. It's not a probabilistic fog. There is a polarizable ether which transmits force and carries electromagnetic waves. The universe is full of an electrically neutral, perfect fluid of neutral particles which passes through atoms and celestial bodies practically as if they weren't there. Neutrinos fit this description. So, the electric universe then defines what it means by energy and mass. Energy is matter in motion relative to the matter in the rest of the universe. It used to be said in relation to the fixed stars. This is not a closed system approach. It is a unifying relational concept first articulated by Ernst Mach. So we define mass. Mass is a measure of particle distortion instead of acceleration in response to the electric forces from all other matter in the universe. It's a bit like pushing a balloon full of water. It will tend to distort rather than move. And it's the same with these orbital systems of electrons and protons and so on. Once again, this conforms with Ernst Mach's principle. Neutrons may not exist in the nucleus. If so, only two particles are necessary to build all of the elements. This idea came from Edwin Karl, who I'm pleased to say is here. and will be presenting in the breakout room. And the problem for physicists is, how do you hold together all of the positive charges in the nucleus? They should repel one another very powerfully. The repulsion of those positive charged protons should prevent it from forming in the first place. However, atomic nuclei seem to require neutrons for stability. That's because when a radioactive atom nucleus decays, neutral particles are sometimes observed to leave the nucleus and exist for a few minutes before further decaying into an electron and a proton. So it was assumed such a neutral particle pre-existed in the nucleus. The what-if question wasn't asked, that maybe that wasn't so. This is an assumption which still does not explain how the positive nucleus remains cohesive. So a special short-range strong nuclear force was invented, a proliferation of forces and particles. Edwin Carl suggested a simpler solution. If the electrons remain as discrete particles in the nucleus, they will tend to arrange themselves to, on average, sit equidistant between the protons. Because the distance between the protons is greater than that between each proton and a neighbouring electron, the attractive electric force between the proton and electron, sorry if this is too fast, will be 4 times greater than the repulsive force. This simple hypothesis removes the need for an extra strong force within the nucleus. It's much simpler. And then it seems that neutrons are a short-lived, metastable resonance of a closely bound proton and electron. This is simple. The electric universe simply proposes structure within structure, a repeated pattern. To understand magnetism and gravity, we must go to the heart of matter, a similar approach to that of André-Marie Ampère, Carl Friedrich Gauss, Wilhelm Weber and Walter Ritz, who considered the behaviour of positive and negative charged particles of different mass with great success, but were ignored for political reasons. Chiefly they weren't English, I think. Here's a simple hypothesis. The electron and proton have stable, resonant orbital structures of smaller charged particles. In that case, the positron, that is the antiparticles, and antiproton are mirror particles. They're not antiparticles, they're mirrors. There is no antimatter, no creation or annihilation. But this requires that there be an ether of composite neutral particles of vanishingly small mass, the neutrinos. The neutrinos must be quite complex inside, but totally collapsed, so that they can accept energy and then become a particle and its mirror. But there's nothing, it's just assumed that when these particles seem to disappear, that they've annihilated, the matter has disappeared. That's not so. So the ether must be normal matter of vanishingly small mass composed of all the subparticles needed to split into an electron and a positron, for example, when subjected to the appropriate energy, electromagnetic energy. For stability, and this is one of the stumbling blocks, of course, for particle physicists to go this way, is that the electric force must act between the tiny particles within the atom instantly. No speed of light delay. The 2 stable particles, the electron and the proton, if we assume the neutron is just a metastable particle, form 254 stable nucleides plus another 85 metastable, that is radioactive nucleides, for a total of 339. So from this simple resonance systems of structure within structure, we have all of the materials we need to see, to make what we see in the world around us. When those nuclei combine with the requisite number of negative electrons to form atoms and molecules, the possibilities are boundless in the living world. What does this mean? Only a single force is necessary, the powerful, instantaneous electric force. The phenomenal strength of the naked electric force can be judged by the simple illustration in the lower left. This shows that if the charge passing through 2 120-watt light bulbs in 1 second were to be transferred equally to 2 metal plates, the repulsive force between those plates would equal 1 million tonnes. So it's critical that the electric force is a balanced force, attractive or repulsive. And these two propositions are the epitome of elegant simplicity, balance. The little diagram there on the left, extreme left at the top, shows the attraction between positive and negative and the repulsion between like particles. There are two forms of the electric force that we experience. One is the electrostatic, where you have separated charge some distance apart, and the electric dipole, where the distance between the two charges becomes so small that the field is altered and you get a different effect called a dipole field. So it just depends on the degree of separation of a positive and negative charge. It's a difference in scale. On our scale, we experience the dipole field of atomic electric fields and subatomic electric fields in the form of magnetism and gravity. They are dipole fields. So both forms of the electrostatic and the dipole field occur between atoms and is responsible for chemistry. The E force operates between all of the particles and subparticles within each atom. In close proximity, this can result in distortion of the atoms to form electric dipoles themselves, which can result in attraction to form a molecule. Or they may enter a new resonant dance by sharing an electron as chemistry. The dipole distorting action on electrons and protons produces dipolar magnetism. The diagram there is actually, I made a mistake, the positive and negative on left and right should be reversed. But this just shows that if you, let's try this thing here. If you have an electric field operating on a particle here, charged particle here, and accelerating it, and on the opposite side, decelerating it, the result will be an elliptical orbit with the nucleus at one of the focuses. And the result of this is that you get a transverse dipole. And that transverse dipole is shown there as the magnetic force, because if you have two current-carrying wires where the electric field in the wire is causing this distortion in electrons, then the dipoles are aligned so that they tend to attract, and we know that current flowing down two wires in the same direction attract, in the opposite way they repel. Okay, so, and the other thing is that I mentioned there ultra-weak dipolar gravity. And this is the diagram of what happens to an atom in that case. The gravitational field cannot be shielded from, so the gravitational force operates on the heavy nucleus so that it falls towards one of the focuses of an ellipse. This time it's oriented radially towards the surface of the body. But the interesting thing about that is that once you've said that, this means that a body like the Earth and the Moon, which I've shown here, the negative poles on both bodies are facing outwards, which means they're repelling one another. So it means that it's long-range repulsive, short-range attractive. We on the surface of the Earth are like iron filings. We don't care which magnet we go to, just the nearest one will do. The gravitational mass of the distant galaxies had a fundamental influence over the motion of the bodies in the solar system. And this is actually shown by precession of the perihelion of the planets, which is tied to the distant stars and not to the sun or general relativity, because general relativity doesn't have a reference frame like that. Short-term changes in the Earth's magnetic field that occur over periods of just years or decades have now been shown in new research to have a very close relationship with changes in gravity. The two are very similar forces. There is no gravitational collapse in space, no black hole swallowing everything. It is the electromagnetic force alone that coalesces matter in deep space. So the assumption that gravity was the controlling force on the large scale is incorrect. There is no need for a Big Bang to separate everything initially. Gravity is a balanced force like magnetism and cannot form neutron stars or other fanciful supercondensed celestial objects. A planet's gravity is established at its birth, by powerful electromagnetic forces. And once the body is formed and the charge on the surface is established, the gravitational field is set by both the surface charge and the initial coalescence by electromagnetic forces. So the outcome of all that is that all matter in the local universe is connected by the electric force instantly. That's Mach's principle. The origin of mass and quantum spooky connection. Because this force is instantaneous, the so-called entanglement and non-locality suddenly has a simple explanation. And energy is a measure of motion with respect to the matter in the rest of the universe. Mass is a measure of the energy stored in the orbital motion inside a particle. And simultaneity means there is a universal time and three-dimensional space. We return to the sanity and simplicity of classical physics. These matter resonances are interesting too because having an orbital structure allows resonant instantaneous connections and complex interactions, which explains weird quantum behaviour. The important thing is that the electron and proton have an orbital charge structure like atoms, which explains their internal energy and their magnetic moment. And distortion in an electric field appears as an increase in mass rather than acceleration. Quantum tunnelling. In transistors, electrons face a barrier like the illustration in the diagram. It's like having to carry a weight over a hill. But in a weird quantum phenomenon called tunnelling, the electron passes through the barrier as if there's a tunnel. The electric universe model of the electron and proton, having an orbital structure of oppositely charged particles, allows us to see that the hill or the repulsive electrical force between similar charges can instantly disappear or become a downhill race. The reason is that the force between two similar particles can become attractive instead of repulsive if you get the particles together at just the right moment. In chemistry, this resonance is achieved by the use of a heavy metal catalyst, which has numerous internal subatomic resonances. The same catalytic process is available, in my opinion, for nuclear fusion. So-called warm fusion is possible by nuclear chemistry, catalysing the nuclei to attract instead of repel. So catalytic chemistry is possible, in my opinion, in the photospheric plasma of all bright stars, where the nuclei are separated from the electrons and can actually come close together in the presence of the heavy elements we see in the spectrum. And you've got to ask the question then, is this the path to future power? Like the sun, but only unlike the sun that is believed by present science. In this way, all stars generate the heavy elements in their photospheres where we detect them in their spectra. Rare exploding supernovae are the most ineffectual production means imaginable, because having produced it, you then disperse it into deep space. There's also an unsuspected resonant means of connection in living systems. The morphic field of Sheldrake, the mind-body connection, consciousness, subtle energies. The electric universe model explains biological transmutations at body temperature as demonstrated by Dr. Louis Kervran. His is a clear demonstration of this simple process. Is light a wave or a particle? If so, what's waving? Einstein did away with a medium to wave. Or is light a particle, a photon? It can't be both a wave and a particle. You'll notice they've merely mouthed a term there. It's particle-like, they say. It's a meaningless use of language. If so, according to Einstein, to travel at the speed of light, it must have zero mass. But a particle of zero mass has no energy. You can't multiply zero by infinity and get a real number. And if it's got zero mass, it can't be affected by gravity, so there can be no gravitational lensing. Lensing occurs as a simple atmospheric diffraction effect in the ether. It's like an atmosphere around the body. Evidence from stars at the galactic centre show no gravitational lensing as expected from standard theory. Clearly, we depend on light to observe the universe, but we don't understand light. Photons don't exist. Light is a transverse electrical disturbance in the ether. And the ether must be a dielectric medium to transfer an electrical disturbance. The wave carries energy through the medium. Just catch up here. And the energy is absorbed by the first atom that is in instantaneous resonance with the sending atom. It gives the appearance that a photon has travelled between the sender and the receiver. It's appearance only. Talking about light brings us to cosmological redshift. Hubble found the fainter and smaller a galaxy appeared, the higher was its redshift. In the diagram, you can see the spectral lines of hydrogen move progressively to the red end of the spectrum as the distance is thought to increase. The redshift was simply assumed to be due to velocity away from us, by analogy with the Doppler shift of sound. Hubble's law is considered the first observational basis for the expansion of the universe. But ironically, Hubble thought it the least likely explanation. He felt it more likely indicated some new physics. So it was Hubble's professional astronomer assistant, Helton C. Arp, who later proved this to be so. If the redshift is not simply a Doppler effect, Hubble wrote, the region observed appears as a small, homogeneous, but insignificant portion of a universe extended indefinitely both in space and time. Recently and surprisingly, more distant galaxies seem to be accelerating away from us. This discovery won the Nobel Prize and gave rise to the need for huge amounts of mysterious dark energy to power the acceleration. I wrote about that discovery on October the 6th, 2011. The discovery of the acceleration of the expanding universe is an interpretation based on total ignorance of the real nature of stars and the standard candle, which was used as the measurement to determine the distance away. So it was gratifying to find support once more in a report this month titled, "Could a new type of supernova eliminate dark energy?" It has been found that the near UV light from the most distant supernovae is brighter than the closer ones. In other words, there's something going on at the atomic and subatomic level. Of course, this is unexpected and unexplained. The diagram on the left shows the difference between the Big Bang universe and the plasma universe. It's easy to see which one is simpler. Intrinsic redshift, and Dr. Helton Arp, Hubble's assistant, who was dubbed the modern Galileo, he found redshifts, quasars physically connected to and in front of, high redshift quasars rather, physically connected to and in front of low redshift active galaxies. This observation of a quasar between the galaxy NGC 7319 and the Earth is impossible if the quasar is over 90 times farther away than the galaxy. So Hubble was right. Something is wrong with physics. Arp showed the redshift happened in small jumps or quanta, which indicates a subatomic effect. But these quantum effects are supposed to only occur at the subatomic level. Here we've got it occurring on the galactic. This requires, once again, the electric force to be operating at ultra high speed, instantaneously. So quasars are born at high speed and with low redshift. This is Arp's diagram. You see the parent galaxy in the centre. Where are we? That's this one here. And the high redshift quasars, and the redshift decreases as they move away. Initially their velocity is very high. They are faint, highly redshifted, and travelling at a fair fraction of the speed of light. Over time, they gain in mass. This is interesting. It means that energy is being supplied to the matter in the quasar, and the mass is increasing. So that eventually they can actually become a turnaround here and become a companion galaxy. This is an example of another path that they can take where you end up with another BL-LAC object, as it's called, producing multiple galaxies here. So there is a genealogy, if you like, of galaxies. The idea that the Andromeda galaxy is going to crash into our galaxy in the future is rubbish. It's based on the idea that Andromeda's blue shift with respect to us means that it's approaching us. No, it just means that it's older than us. So the electric universe explains this. Quasars are born at high speed and with low mass. They escape the forces of the electromagnetic galactic nucleus, that's the parent galaxy, as neutrons. And because the neutrons have no charge, they can escape the intense electromagnetic forces that hold that plasmoid in the centre of the galaxy. They have enough time to get away from those powerful forces, and then they decompose into electrons and protons, which are the forerunners of hydrogen. So as the electrical energy pours into the quasar, its mass and brightness increases and it slows down to become a companion galaxy. So this was an explanation, the only explanation for Halton Arp's observations. Quasars are not the brightest and most distant objects in the universe. They are among the youngest and closest, so the objects in the mirror really are closer than they appear. The visible universe is smaller than we have been told. So the universe, the real universe, is in balance. It is not expanding. This is important for our understanding of gravity. Gravity cannot be simply an attractive force. The universe is of unknown age and extent. The origin of the universe is unknown. There is a universal now, and space has 3 physical dimensions. This brings everything back down to, as Tom was pointing out, conditions as we experience it on Earth. Dark matter galaxies. Galaxies are treated as isolated objects in space produced somehow by attractive gravity in an expanding universe. Their rotation and structure remains a mystery. They're made of 80% invisible dark matter. Well, Tom gave a good introduction to that story about dark matter. Dark matter has been described as an invisible elephant in the room. You know it's there by the dent it makes in the floorboards. Dark matter is only inferred theoretically by using our experience of gravity on Earth and projecting it onto the rest of the universe. Once again, it's this geocentric problem. We look at the gravity on Earth and then we just extrapolate outwards, because that's all mathematicians can do. It needs an impossible gravitational black hole in the centre. Black holes exist theoretically in asymptotically flat space in an empty universe. You cannot superimpose any other matter in such a hypothetical universe. Black holes don't exist. Yet some sport long, thin, high-velocity jets over intergalactic distances. There is no satisfactory theoretical explanation for these jets. This is the standard, taking the standard approach. Electric galaxies, on the other hand, plasma cosmology shows experimentally and observationally that galaxies are governed by electromagnetic forces. Tony Peratt said that they introduced gravity into their supercomputer runs and it made no difference whatsoever. Spirals rotate as simple Faraday motors. That's why that curve is flat. It's as if you've got a plate and you're just spinning the plate. Stars are born in and trace the spiral power lines. Where there is a higher density of gas and dust, it's typical of an electrical discharge. Where the density of the material becomes greater, the discharge becomes more filamentary. Stars form along those pinched current filaments. There are no black holes. It's a compact high-energy plasmoid, and this comes down to peer-reviewed plasma cosmology. Their apparent mass is due to the relationship between mass and energy. If E equals mc squared, if you've got a high concentration of energy in that tiny plasmoid, it will exhibit a considerable mass. It's certainly not a black hole. The other thing is that galaxies line up axially, showing their electrical connectedness because they're threaded like Catherine wheels on a wire. And that wire is one of these intergalactic Birkeland current filaments. So let's look at stars. We've done galaxies, let's look at stars. Arthur Eddington had the temerity to say, it should not be too difficult to understand something as simple as a star. This is typical left hemisphere. His quote is typical: isolate, simplify and ignore a global view, because if you look at coronas, sunspots, flares, magnetic cycles, etc., his gas model doesn't predict any of them. And the alternatives are not explored. He dismisses electrical aspects in a few paragraphs. The failure of this approach is shown by continual complications with each new discovery. It's treated as an isolated gravitating ball of gas. Conventionally, it's a body that satisfies three conditions. It's made of hydrogen plus a few impurities. Having a core of the lightest element is the most fanciful assumption. It's needed to allow the thermonuclear energy model to be viable. That also requires hypothetical extreme conditions in the core. It's only required by the thermonuclear theory and is completely untestable. It also has, that's unverifiable, and also the sequence of nuclear reactions that take place in the core cannot be verified. They're very complex and requires quantum tunneling, which I referred to earlier. And what's more, there's a more complex, different story for different stars. It's certainly not simple. It's an explosive model because one of the reactions is sensitive to the temperature to the fifth power. It also needs an unknown radiation zone to break down the X-rays from the nuclear core. There's nobody known that has a radiation or the energy transferred through the body through a radiation zone, so this is hypothetical. And also, from the point of view of life on Earth and so on, it has a restrictive and variable Goldilocks zones distant from the star. It's not the best place to nurture life in the universe. Impossible stars. Formation by gravitational accretion doesn't work. It's never been explained satisfactorily. It has hydrogen, the lightest element in the core. The model doesn't predict the observed features or behaviour. It has different models for white dwarfs, neutron stars, etc. And the life story of stars is super complicated and untestable. And some stars do strange things. They switch from one place to another without going through the transition stages. Renowned scientists like Eddington, who made grave mistakes about the sun and Einstein's general relativity, he went out explicitly to prove Einstein correct, not to test his theory, continue to haunt us today. It gives the lie to the belief that science is self-correcting. It is not, given the way in which science is done today. As Eddington said, if there's no other way out, we may have to suppose that bright line spectra in the stars are produced by electric discharges. The clues were there, but what if was not followed through. Herschel reveals a ribbon of future stars. This was reported on March the 30th this year. So this is a very recent picture. Stars and planets are formed by powerful electromagnetic forces like pearls on a cosmic string. This is a quote from an earlier report. Gravity can be ignored. Plasma cosmology. There is no gravitational accretion. There's no way you can form a string like that using gravity. Gravity is a central force and the material tends to come into a centre. It doesn't form a string. But this recent report says, and this is important, stars are shot out of the filaments by a slingshot mechanism. And there's a diagram here which shows the filaments moving around like those in the plasma ball, where they snake about. The stars, having been formed in this filament, are left behind as the filament moves on, and these stars are shot out. And it's interesting because Tony Peratt described to us once the effect seen in high-energy discharge experiments as these plasmoids scattered like buckshot. Now, it's not only stars that are formed here, it's all solid bodies, including planets. And they may be captured by the stars to form the weird assortment, over 3,500 of them so far, of exoplanetary systems that have been observed. New stars also may fission to produce hot Jupiters in very close orbits and achieve electrical stability with their changing electrical environment. The movement of the filaments, as I said, is like those in a plasma ball. Heavy elements convect into a cool core. This is interesting because those blue filaments you saw before are the coldest part of the cloud, and this is where the stars are forming. The traditional view is that the stars had to form by gravitational collapse and not lose any of the heat of the collapse, otherwise they couldn't start their nuclear fires. Well, this doesn't require any of that. It was one of the surprises for theorists is that the blue filament I mentioned is the coldest part of the cloud and contains 800 times as much mass as the Sun. This is not a surprise for plasma cosmologists. So, all stars have a cool planetary core. Stars and many planets are born together along the same electrical umbilical cord. Other planets and moons are born later in electrical fissioning events and capture events. Hydrogen and helium tend to form the outermost atmosphere. This is a diagram showing the actual form of the filaments. You'll notice the pattern there. This is showing an experimental pattern of a discharge on an insulating plate. And this shows a Martian electrical scar. You can see the similarities. As the cosmic lightning bolt fades, stars and planets are captured into planetary systems. So, electric stars, they remain a gaseous electric discharge phenomena, like spherical searchlights following their birth. In fact, some of the characteristics of the photosphere is like that of a searchlight. All bright stars catalytically produce heavy elements in their photospheric plasma discharges. Red stars have gigantic anode sheaths. Sorry, I'll get the right picture there. Plasma discharges adjust to their environment by moving electrical barriers called plasma sheaths, or misleadingly magnetospheres, because they trap the magnetic fields inside. If Jupiter's plasma sheath were lit up, it would appear the size of the full moon in the sky at opposition. And its Galilean moons would be orbiting comfortably inside it. So red dwarfs are not dwarfs, and their bloated glowing anode sheaths are the cosmic wombs for life. Because inside that radiant red sphere, all satellites receive uniform heat and light over their entire surfaces. And it doesn't matter how they're moving or rotating, that will be the case. Of course, this poses a problem for the SETI project because radio waves cannot penetrate the glowing plasma sheath. So if these are the wombs of life, we don't have any way of radio communication with them. But of course, gravity can pass through. White dwarfs are not dwarfs at all, they're just stars with no bright photosphere and a faint white coronal discharge. These are some of the planetary systems that have been discovered. You can see it's quite a shambles. So as I said before, at the galactic scale, electromagnetic forces form these gigantic Birkeland currents and they dominate. At the planetary scale, inside the star's protective plasma sheath, gravity dominates. So you have to choose the region you're talking about when you're trying to apply your model to stars, galaxies, and so on. In fact, inside the star's protective sheath, with gravity dominating, And it dominates because it cannot be electrically shielded. So the impact from all of the other stars in the universe is acting like a pressure in on the planets moving around the sun. In fact, this repulsive force from the rest of the universe can reverse the Earth's motion about the sun in 6 months. That is 6 sextillion tonnes by 140,000 miles an hour. So that gives you an idea of the impact. Then the thunderbolts of the gods operate to modify masses. In planetary systems, the electric force comes into play only when plasma sheaths collide, because then the electrical insulation breaks down and the electric current flows between the two bodies. Then the thunderbolts of the gods operate to modify masses and change orbits and to quickly re-establish order. This is one of the problems that Velikovsky faced. How do you explain events within the memory of mankind of chaos in the solar system, and yet it looks like clockwork today? And this is the answer. You have to apply the electric model of gravity to be able to do this. So Velikovsky was right. Electricity and magnetism are involved in the celestial mechanism. Changing the surface charge on a planet modifies the strength of the internal electric dipole, which is responsible for the planet's mass and gravity. And the changes to both bodies, which I've shown in previous YouTube talks, tends to move the two bodies apart, which is very convenient. This overcomes the objections of the Harvard book burners to Velikovsky's Worlds in Collision. However, it doesn't detract from the title to say that worlds didn't collide. It was an electrical clash of the titans. There's Velikovsky with his great book. So what we have now in science is a mythical journey. It is a rehash of a creation myth. The Earth was born and for 4.5 billion years has remained roughly where it is now. Long ago, the Earth had a few massive impacts to birth the Moon and almost wipe out life on Earth at intervals. Ironically, planetary collisions have been found essential 66 years after Velikovsky's book, Worlds in Collision, was burned. Thousands of exoplanetary systems don't fit the story. There are stars that shouldn't exist, hot Jupiters that orbit their star in hours or days, backward orbits and polar orbits. Life on Earth remains unexplained. The odds against random events producing life are practically infinite. The rest of the story is once upon a time fragmented, boring and non-predictive. We are an isolated and improbable accident. That's why we have difficulty imagining life elsewhere in the universe. Alan Alda complains, everybody is ignorant about science. Alda was 11 years as host of Scientific American Frontiers on PBS, and he helped inspire the creation of the Centre for Communicating Science at Stony Brook in 2009. Is it any wonder when this is the face of science today? There is no real meaning or morality in modern mechanistic science to engage students or the public. Everyone thinks it is all mathematics. It saddens me to see so much talent wasted in the pursuit of myth, hunting for dark matter. Their heads have been filled with it. Our real journey. Are you looking for the nearest exoplanet? We're standing on it. Pay attention to the oldest stories of the celestial gods who created the skies and land we see today. Yoro Yoro is a research book about the Kimberley region Aborigines in Western Australia. And some of their stories are so close to the reconstruction of the Saturnian polar configuration that it's almost scary. And these are the words from the elders, and they were very precise in their words. It says, in the beginning, people saw before the Ice Age that the moon, sun, and some of the stars had been on Earth. In other words, they were very close. One song told about a flood long before the last that was brought on by a star with trails. The symbols that testify to these events are still in the Kimberley. The Wandjina creator figure, which is the one you can see on the front of the book there, features are explained. All rings around the head represent clouds and lightning. The big spirit Wandjina have large eyes. This is the eye god motif that Dave Talbot has explained at length. They never have a mouth nor ears, and the line between the eyes indicates where the power flows down, and it's not a nose. And it looks like a hollow tube, which in the plasma column scenario of the Saturnian story is accurate. Wollonganda, the creator Wandjina, did not create with his hands, only through his voice with power. It reminds me of In the Beginning Was the Word. Andy Hall has recently explained that the overpressure from supersonic shock waves, that is from the electrical blasts that strike the surface of a body, are powerful enough to form mountains. Rock flows until the overpressure drops, whereupon it solidifies instantly, but retains an imprint of the shock wave. Those shock waves would have produced harmonics and overtones, a global sound like a symphony of giant trumpets. There's many traditions about the creation being associated with sound. This little book I bought in Central Australia on a visit to Uluru, that great red rock, which looks just like an asteroid has landed. And it also tells a story by these people in the Kimberleys, but it's illustrated by children, and it's very quaint. The story is by David Mowaljale, who's the elder. It tells of two suns in the sky who lived in hollow logs, the plasma columns. There is a period of intense heat from them. Then one sun is attacked with a spear, the thunderbolt, and is bitten by a snake, Cometary Venus, who lives in the sky. The little sun gets snagged in the fork of a celestial tree, which is the Axis Mundi, the tree of life, the celestial tree. So this is an extension of the forensic technique that Velikovsky introduced. He never referred to the Australian Aborigines, but some of their memories seem to be so accurate that they are a better source than some of the more so-called advanced cultural reports. All of these story elements make sense to mytho-historians and to the leading plasma cosmologist and colleague of Hans Alfvén, Tony Peratt. Accept best evidence regardless of its fit with modern consensus science and man-made theoretical laws. It is better to adopt a forensic science approach to the evidence for past events that cannot be repeated than to rely on theoretical science which is based on sets of beliefs and a geocentric perspective. Use that evidence to develop a more holistic science that brings our phenomenal real journey to light. To be real and useful, science must be holistic. The electric universe is a holistic science that applies seamlessly from the galactic to the earthly to the biosphere and on down to subatomic particles. Humanity's dramatic experience of the electrical nature of celestial mechanics would make an awe-inspiring and frightening IMAX movie that would make science fiction seem a pale shadow in comparison. But in my opinion, once understood, there will be no irrational urge to revisit doomsday upon each other and the Earth under the unrecognised banners of the prehistoric warring planetary gods. Planets bear the scars of their electrical birth and past encounters on their faces. Apollo astronauts commented on the fresh appearance of lunar craters. The event that caused the great gash across the face of Mars appears in stories from ancient cultures. These are just yesterday in geological time. I recommend you see episode 2, Symbols of an Alien Sky, the lightning-scarred planet Mars. We may understand our history and place in the electric universe for the first time. This is singularly important for our sense of well-being. It gives dramatic new meaning to our lives and a sense of responsibility for our jewel of a planet. Without this sense, we probably have no future on Earth. Also, in the event myth becomes science. There was a unique myth-making period, and all surviving cultures required their stories to be faithfully transmitted for millennia. Such was their importance. We look at these enigmatic rock art figures from the remote Kimberley region in Western Australia and see only their strange, haunting and artistic beauty. And it was rather ironic that just a week or so ago, and David Novak was there to see it too, I think, they had the Vivid Festival in Sydney, where they project images onto public buildings, and of course the Opera House is the most public building in Sydney. And this was a presentation of Wandjina figures. I mean, they are haunting, and I think they probably evoke some kind of a subconscious connection. But how much more would they mean if people really understood their origin? We need to give more credit to the Indigenous people. Now, Evan Camp said that one of the unique aspects of the electric universe theory is that it's good storytelling. It answers all three questions. What if? What if the sky was different in the past? What if Saturn was worshipped as the sun? What if there were electrical discharges between planets? Let's catch up here. What if there were electric discharges between planets? Today we have meteorites from Mars. What if Lichtenberg figures explain the scars on Mars and Earth? Show students pictures of cratering on different bodies and ask students to explain them from 2 points of view. The standard model needs different explanations for each. Oops, sorry. That was unexpected. The electric universe, on the other hand, has a single explanation for them all. Then there is the story of the dissidents. If only Birkeland hadn't been ignored, Hans Alfvén had been listened to, Halton Arp's research hadn't been dismissed. A Pixar rule for storytelling, number 16, what are the stakes? Give us reasons to support the character. What happens if they don't succeed? Stack the odds against them. What of the future if this goes on? We continue wasting money and careers looking for things that don't exist. We cripple students by not training them to think. We may have no future on this planet. As Evan Camp says, the power of eliciting engagement is to get people to come to their own conclusions. Thinking is going to be the future of education. So, our electric universe future. Mahatma Gandhi said, there is a force in the universe which, if we permit it, will flow through us and produce miraculous results. The electric universe is an inspiring story that motivates students both conceptually and artistically, and that is what's needed for left and right brain hemisphere development. Education, classical science and the arts, left and right hemispheres. Let's just catch up here. Many principles of the electric universe were foreseen by scholars in the past, Newton, Faraday, etc. A release from existential fear, Velikovsky's The Bonds of the Past, a documentary. There is a collective inability to face the truth that prehistoric mankind faced doomsday. For millennia, science has preached stability and order, but as amnesiacs, we have a compulsion to instinctively repeat the catastrophes of the past, destroying each other and the earth from the sky with apocalyptic weapons, like the planetary gods of old. This was one of Velikovsky's greatest fears. But we have, on the other hand, the possibility of an unparalleled renaissance with the electric universe, bringing everything together seamlessly. Understanding ourselves and our past can heal the wounds and provide a more universal sense of connection and purpose. Understand the electric force of nature. power like the sun, and gravity. Quantum interactions. All three rely on understanding matter interactions via the instantaneous electric force. Understanding living organisms, the mind-body connection and beyond. Also, understanding the dangers of genetically modified organisms and manufactured food. There is no thought given to the effects, the unintended consequences of fiddling with these things when our basic knowledge is so lacking. And the idea in an electric universe is to live in tune with the earth and each other. Resonant connection. On the most general level, the electric universe is a new paradigm of universal resonant connection. The arbitrary inertial frames of reference of physics are not equivalent when everything is connected in real time. How and where you are makes a difference to your energy state. For example, the GPS system is supposed to prove relativity theory. It doesn't. The atoms in orbiting clocks have a different energy from identical clocks on Earth. So engineers simply count a different number of ticks to compensate. Time is universal, unchanging and unchangeable. Clocks are not. Think of the relationships between all things connected by the universal electric force and consider that the electric force must act instantly, otherwise no information transfer is possible between resonant tuned systems. Spacecraft using slow speed of light transmissions require constant retuning of receivers on Earth to compensate for their motion. Obviously, living systems could not function if moving parts of the body lost contact with the brain. Acknowledging this simple fact will explain quantum weirdness and open up science, particularly biology, to amazing possibilities that are presently forbidden. And understanding gravity and magnetism as balancing electric forces will change forever our view of the heavens and the earth under our feet. As the morphic resonance experiments of the biologist Rupert Sheldrake have shown, the things that are learnt by one organism are immediately available to others like them, anywhere on Earth. The universe learns. Resonance between molecular tuning forks allows instant information transfer, the mind-body connection, and beyond. Life is structured water. This was said to me by Gerald Pollack. The experiments, or his experiments, show the structure of electrically polarised water molecules gives rise to water's amazing properties. It allows information to be stored and transferred within a living cell, the memory mechanism of homeopathy. It suggests that the electrically polarisable ether particles may also participate in information storage as well as transmission. The electric universe resonant electrical model of matter and the all-pervasive neutrino ether suggests that resonance and structure within structure can store unlimited information and transfer it instantly. There is more to life than meets the eye. We have always known that instinctively. The electric universe suggests that the information needed for life, forget the gene, that's just the factory floor, is universal, so life can take hold wherever conditions arise that allow it. We see evidence for that in the great changes immediately following catastrophic mass extinctions on Earth. We see it in organisms living in anoxic conditions over volcanic vents on the ocean floor and at great depths in rocks. Just as gravity cannot be shielded, since all matter participates in force transfer, so it is with this universal information bank. There are no islands in space. We are earthlings in the complete resonant connection sense, in a meaningful electrical universe. The fact that we exist suggests a purposeful universe. Our lives have purpose. We don't manifest as a blank slate. So children should be observed and supported in their individual passions, not suppressed and moulded to our desires for them. We are born with a purpose, but many need help to discover that purpose. In answering the question, why are we so unhappy, Ian McGilchrist says, true happiness is based on connections with others and a sense of purpose beyond the immediate. True happiness is one aim of this conference. The new panorama of an amazing shared history and kinship must change the world. In the search for meaning, the electric universe paradigm can, as Ian McGilchrist says, change the world. Elegance, harmony, and simplicity of concepts are the electric universe guiding principles. Thank you.